So what I will be presenting today is just a rough sketch of an idea of how I thought of integrating creative methodology in the research that I will be doing around groundwater in India. So the title of the presentation is Troubling Groundwaterscapes. So I would like to stay with this concept of troubling and creating different vision and think about how can counter-cartography make visible the groundwater, which is an invisible common resource. So a bit of a background of my PhD research. So I look at local understanding and practices of climate resilience, and the aim of the work is really to create counter-narrative to the top-down approaches that are generally advanced by development organizations. My area of work will be in Maharashtra, which is a state in India that is drought affected, and I'll be looking particularly at uses and practices around groundwater in that area. So appreciating that probably in the room we don't all study and research the same topic. So what is climate resilience? Resilience framework have been sort of started in the 1970s and were mainly developed for studying ecological approaches to understanding how closed social and ecological systems reacted and could cope and deal with change and uncertainty. This kind of framework has then been taken up particularly within climate change research and disaster risk research to understand really the capability and coping capacities of a system and its component to anticipate and absorb and recover from the effect of hazardous event in a timely and efficient manner. This is the definition of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, how it measures resilience. So the sort of terminology about resilience has taken up in recent years, particularly within development practices. And there has been some people starting, for example, the New York Times saying, forget about sustainability, it's time to talk about resilience. However, this is not without sort of problems, particularly within the social sciences. Many have argued how a resilience framework looking particularly at a system dynamic does not unpack what happens within the system. So what are the sort of inequalities that could make a system resilience itself? So some have said it's apolitical, it's used to advance neoliberal agenda, and it's basically a banner to continue development as usual. So with my research, I try to really explore how can creative methodology be a medium to generate a different vision and a different perspective to talk about resiliency when we consider local actors and practices on the ground. So I wanna sort of like try to unpack this system approach to talk about socio-natural entities connected not just within the system but across system components, and try to empower different visions of our society and future and environment for the future. So as I said, I will be looking at groundwater. So groundwater is a particularly interesting resource because it's stored, it's invisible and fugitive. So for those that don't have sort of like a geographical ecological background, groundwater is stored in aquifer. Aquifers are just rock formations that are underneath the surface. So how groundwater is accessed really depends on the property of the aquifer. So in the area where I will be working, the geological formation makes the aquifer particularly confined and small. So it is not uncommon to find within a same village and within a same community that two consecutive farmer, one is able to access groundwater and the other one doesn't. So what kind of consequence does this have for the livelihood on the ground? Also ownership. In India in particular, the access and ownership of groundwater is tied to the ownership of the land. So this creates particularly different, difficult perspectives when we talk about landless people or women that do not generally are able to inherit land. So recent trend in groundwater extraction, so during the 70s and 80s with the so-called Green Revolution and the adoption of sort of like technologies, electrification, groundwater has played a particularly important role in decreasing poverty in rural areas and improving the livelihoods of rural communities. Also, in cases where there is recurring sort of water scarcity, groundwater also provides a buffer that can be accessed at times of scarcity. However, this differential ability to access groundwater has also widened the gap between people with different degrees of access, and also generated conflicts, because it's really hard to measure how much groundwater is extracted and by whom, and generally wells that are privately owned are within one's own field premises. So it's really hard to understand how much groundwater exploitation is happening, and this creates really hidden conflicts within different sectors, so particularly talking about rural versus urban, industrial versus agricultural, so on and so forth. So clearly there are multiple visions of groundwater, multiple ways of seeing and using this resource, and some visions seem to be privileged over others. So with my sort of the way that I want to use creativity is how to trouble this vision of the aquifer, how to make visible other practices, other ways of accessing and using groundwater. And the way that I want to do is by using maps. So what I like about maps is this sort of like ambiguity that maps bring with them. So on the one hand, you have this sort of like maps are seen as scientific, no? We can all go on Google Maps and put one location to another and be sure to reach one place following the same path. However, maps also, when you talk about particularly within the colonial context, they have been largely used as a textual device, as a device to sort of create meanings and create subjectivities within the local population. So making certain resources visible, making certain people more visible on the map, have created sort of like a power structure of a power dynamic within the map. So I want to use maps as a discursive device, and what I found particularly interesting as I was doing some readings is the differentiation between vision, that is the ability that we have to see with our eyes, and visuality, that really talks about how do different people, how is vision constructed in different ways. So why, if we all stand in front of a landscape or an object, how it comes that people will draw different things and give relevance to different things in a different ways. So staying with this sort of tension between vision and visuality, I want to sort of create a groundwaterscape that it represents visualities and not visions. So this is made of different types of maps, particularly 3 types of maps are those that I've identified so far, that are taken from different perspectives. They see the aquifer, so they see the same groundwater resource, but they talk about different perspectives and different vision. So the first one is the sort of like what we're all used to work with and what we're all used to like think about maps, and they're top-down maps. And so they are hydrogeological maps. So the first 2 that you can see in the top part, they are created by looking at the properties of the rocks that are underneath the ground, and also going and mapping the different wells and the depth at which the water table reaches the well, so that you're able to like making a cross section to understand what kind of well is tapping onto which aquifer, sort of to understand what type of maybe conflicts or competition around groundwater, who's using the same resource, maybe without knowing it. Other types of map could be administrative map, cadastral map, also textual data could be read as a sort of a map. So this screenshot is the Maharashtra Groundwater Act that legislates groundwater at the level of the aquifer. So also like the decision about how do we make legislation about groundwater? Is it at the level of the watershed? Is it at the level of the aquifer? Makes a difference in terms of the vision and the accessibility that people have to the resource. So these are really like map from the top, those that are seen as the maps that tell the truth, so to say. And I would like to sort of compare, and not to compare, to like pair with this kind of map with another way of mapping back, so doing different techniques and different types of ethnographic mapping. And they will sort of like, these are just very initial ideas of things that I would like to do with maps with the research participants in terms of map elicitation. So asking research participants to draw a map before going on to the interview process, to discuss about the daily routines, practices, and path that they follow during the daily practices around groundwater, transect walk with different community members, mapping water sources in a community. So what I found particularly interesting is that with the increasing recurrence of scarcities and drought in the areas where I will be working, the type of water source have shifted. So before there was much more communal water sources that are like hand pump and tube and dug wells, and as more people had to react to the situation of scarcity, the more the water sources started becoming private. And the more the water sources becoming private, the more sort of this competition became invisible. So tracking how much water, groundwater was extracted is becoming more and more difficult. So understanding when did the private wells were dug, when does the well dry up, if there have been any deepening of the well, any side drilling, this could sort of signal a sort of like situation of competition that is happening. Another type of mapping or representation of the words is by collecting different types of painting, songs. So what we can see here, this is a Worley painting. This is particularly characteristic of the area where I will be doing my research, and it's just a representation of the daily activities in the community. The third ingredient are reflexive cartography. So this kind of ideas really build from sort of readings, particularly within feminist research, and they really talk about the issues of reflexivity and the issue of positionality while doing the research. So one quote that someone in the presentation earlier said is, "Nothing about us is without us." So it's really important to acknowledge who are you when you enter the research process, how does your presence within the research practice affect the outcomes, and how is your subjectivity also affected during the course of the work. So I aim to kind of use mapping and visualization during the course of my studies to track my own positionality and subjectivity during the research. So this is just like an initial sketch of what I bring to the research practice. So I come from an engineering background. I'm coming to the social sciences as someone that has a different sort of perspectives or idea, different ways of conducting research, some obstacles. So what I'm particularly aware is not just the issue with translation in terms of language translation, but also the idea of representation. How can I make a research that is truthful enough, and how can I give back to the communities my research outcomes? So some worries in terms of the amount of literature that I have to work with, maintaining a good work-life balance, and so on. Another type of way that I found particularly interesting in this initial month is just doing sketches in terms of helping me to understand what type of research, what type of framework do I want to be using. So for example here, as I was saying, the resilience framework is really one that talks about closed system analysis. It sees the groundwater as legislated at the level of the watershed. It sees ecological and social entities as being distinct from one another, and disturbances risk as something that comes from the outside. And what I want to do is really to try to open and unpack this system approach to discuss about how are social and natural entity co-constituting one another. So I find this sort of drawings particularly useful to make me think as I go along the research. Also to like sketch out what type of literature I would like to be drawn upon, what type of terminology and themes that I would like to draw as I go on with my work. So at the end of it, what I propose to do during these 3 years that I will be collecting and analyzing all this type of information is to make an installation that represents this groundwaterscape. And this installation is really an idea to make things about the fact that there's not just one vision, not just one objective reality. There's not just one type of seeing and living and interacting with groundwater as a resource as to cope with climate change.